There is a psychological paradox that many kind people take years to realize. When you sacrifice more and more for others, you actually become more invisible in their eyes. At first, your sacrifice is noticed. People thank you. They say you are wonderful, reliable, and admirable. You are the person who always shows up when someone is in trouble, the one willing to take on extra responsibility, the one who quietly carries emotional pressure without complaining. But over time, a very subtle change begins to happen. What was once called kindness slowly turns into obligation. What once made people grateful becomes something they simply assume you are supposed to do. And that is the moment when many people begin to ask themselves, why is it that the person who sacrifices the most is often the one who is appreciated the least? In this video, we will explore the psychology behind people who always sacrifice too much for others, why this happens, and what is really going on in the minds of those who constantly put other people's needs before their own. If you have ever felt like you are the one who always gives but is rarely understood, stay until the end of the video. You might discover an important truth that no one has ever told you before. And if you are interested in deep perspectives on human psychology, subscribe to the channel and watch the video until the very end. Because sometimes just a small understanding can change the way you see yourself and the relationships around you. One of the hardest things to notice for people who always sacrifice for others is that this change happens very slowly. It does not happen in a single day, nor after any major event. It happens quietly, little by little, through very small moments that almost no one notices. One time you agree to take on extra work even though you are tired. One time you give up your opinion to avoid an argument. One time you put your personal needs aside because you think someone else needs it more. Each individual action seems reasonable, even admirable. But when those small actions repeat dozens, even hundreds of times, they begin to create a pattern that both you and the people around you become familiar with. In psychology, behavioral patterns are extremely powerful. People do not only respond to what others say, but also to what they consistently do. When someone continually gives without setting clear boundaries, the brains of the people around them gradually form a stable expectation. Not because they want to take advantage, but because they have become used to things always being resolved in that way. This person always helps. This person is always available. This person will not refuse. And when a pattern becomes a habit, it begins to operate almost automatically. People no longer stop to think about whether it is fair or not. They simply respond according to what they are used to. It is similar to when you are always the one who organizes everything in a group of friends. After a while, everyone will naturally look to you whenever there is a new plan. Not because they do not respect you, but because that role has gradually become part of the system. The irony is that the people who sacrifice the most are often the ones who rarely talk about their own needs. They are used to being the problem solver, the peacekeeper, the listener. In many cases, they even feel slightly uncomfortable when they have to ask for something for themselves, not because they have no needs, but because they are accustomed to placing their needs last. Over time, this silence creates a gap in other people's perception. If someone never says they are tired, people will assume they are fine. If someone never says they need help, people will think they do not need it. And if someone always shows up to support others, people will gradually believe that they always have enough energy to do so. This is one of the deeper reasons why many kind people feel lonely in relationships. They are not lacking people around them. They are not lacking conversations, but they are missing something very important, the feeling that their own needs are also seen. When this continues long enough, a very difficult emotion begins to appear. It is not exactly anger, nor completely sadness. It feels more like a quiet exhaustion, a sense that you have tried very hard, yet no one truly understands it. And sometimes what hurts the most is not having to give too much, but the feeling that you're giving has gradually become invisible. Many people in this situation begin to question themselves. They wonder whether they are being too sensitive, whether they are expecting too much, or perhaps this is simply how relationships work. But when we look deeper, we see that the problem rarely lies in kindness. Kindness, when combined with self-respect, remains one of the most powerful human qualities. The problem often lies in prolonged imbalance. In any relationship, whether it is friendship, family, or work, the balance of emotional energy plays a very important role. When one person continuously gives while the other mostly receives, that system will sooner or later become strained. Not because the receiver intentionally wants to be selfish, but because they have never been placed in a position where they must recognize the other person's limits. One interesting thing many psychologists have observed is that when people who sacrifice too much begin to establish small boundaries, other people's reactions often change very quickly. At first, there may be surprise, sometimes even discomfort, but after a while, people gradually adjust their behavior because clear boundaries help others understand where generosity ends and respect must begin. This does not mean that kind people need to become cold or selfish. In fact, the goal is not to stop caring about others. The goal is to learn how to care about yourself with the same level of seriousness. Because when someone only gives without ever replenishing their own energy, their kindness eventually turns into exhaustion. And the deepest paradox is that when a person begins to respect their own needs, others often begin to respect them more as well. Not because they have become less kind, but because they are sending a different signal. A signal that their kindness is a conscious choice, not an endless obligation. When kindness is combined with boundaries, it is no longer a silent sacrifice. It becomes a powerful action, one that has value and is seen more clearly within relationships. And that is often the moment when many people realize an important truth for the first time. Giving is beautiful, but only when the giver also remembers that they deserve respect, care, and space for themselves. The moment a person who is used to sacrificing begins to say no is usually not loud. It is not a rebellion, nor is it a grand declaration in front of everyone. Often, it is simply a very small decision, spoken in a calm voice. But psychologically, it is a profound turning point. Because for the first time in many years, that person is changing a pattern that has existed for a very long time in the way they relate to the world. What is interesting is that when someone begins to set boundaries, the initial reaction from the surrounding environment is sometimes not what they imagined. Some people may be surprised. A few may feel slightly uncomfortable. Some may even ask again, as if it were unusual, "Why aren't you helping today?" Or, "Are you okay?" These reactions do not necessarily mean that others are selfish. Most of the time, they simply reflect a change in a familiar system. When a role has existed for too long, the problem solver, the one who is always available, the one who keeps the peace, any change forces everyone to adjust their expectations. And adjustment always takes time. But if that person continues to maintain their new boundaries calmly and consistently, something very interesting usually begins to happen. The people around them gradually learn something they never had to learn before, that this person also has limits, that their time and energy also have value, that their help is not a default but a conscious choice. Over time, this small change can shift the entire dynamic of relationships. When one person is no longer always the first to sacrifice, others begin to participate more. Responsibilities become shared. Attention becomes more balanced. And surprisingly, in many cases, respect also begins to appear more clearly. Because in human psychology, respect is often connected to things that are protected. Things that have boundaries are often perceived as having value, not because they are intentionally rare, but because they show that the person who holds them understands their importance. This is also when many people begin to realize a truth they had never considered before. For many years, they believed that sacrifice was the best way to maintain love, friendship, or connection. They believed that the more they gave, the stronger the relationship would become. But reality is more complex than that. Relationships are systems of emotional energy. They develop most healthily when there is a two-way exchange. When one person constantly gives while the other only receives, that system gradually becomes unbalanced. At first, the imbalance may not be obvious, but over time, it often leads to exhaustion on one side and dependency on the other. When boundaries begin to appear, balance has a chance to return. The person who once sacrificed too much begins to have more space for themselves. They can rest without feeling guilty. They can prioritize what matters to them without thinking that it is selfish. And more importantly, they begin to realize that their value does not lie only in their ability to help others. This is often a very important stage in psychological growth. Because when a person separates their self worth from the role of the one who always sacrifices, they begin to build a more balanced identity. They can still be kind, they can still be generous, but that generosity no longer comes from the pressure to be accepted. It comes from a free choice. And when kindness becomes a choice instead of an obligation, it often becomes much more powerful. Because at that point, every act of helping carries intention. It is no longer an automatic reflex, but a decision made with full awareness of one's own limits. This also brings a subtle change in how others perceive their presence. When a person is no longer always available at every moment, their presence begins to carry more weight. When they say yes, that agreement carries more meaning. And when they help, the action is once again seen clearly as generosity, rosity, rather than a default obligation. Some relationships may not adapt to this change. Relationships that were built on one-sided sacrifice may sometimes grow distant when balance is restored. But interestingly, healthy relationships often become stronger because they are rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than dependency. And for the person who used to sacrifice too much, this change often brings a very strange feeling at first. It is the feeling of having space for themselves, space to think about what they want, space to rest without needing to explain, space to exist as a complete human being, not just a source of support for others. In many cases, it is the first time they realize that kindness does not have to come with exhaustion. Care does not have to mean neglecting oneself, and setting boundaries does not reduce their value in the eyes of others. On the contrary, it often helps their kindness become clearer, more genuine, and more sustainable. Because in the end, the healthiest relationships are not built on the silent sacrifice of one person, but on mutual respect and care among everyone involved. When a person who has been used to sacrificing for a long time begins to change, what they experience is not only reactions from the outside, but also a deep dialogue within themselves. Because saying no for the first time is not only a social action, but also a psychological challenge. In that moment, they often have to face a very familiar feeling, the feeling of guilt. Many people are surprised to realize that protecting themselves can make them feel as if they are doing something wrong. They may wonder whether they are becoming colder, whether they are hurting others, but in reality, this feeling is usually not a sign of selfishness. It is simply the trace of a psychological habit that has existed for too long. When a person is used to always putting others first, any change can make them feel as if they are breaking an invisible rule. What is important to understand is that this rule is not always an objective truth. Many rules about sacrifice are formed from past experiences, from situations in the past where giving in was the best way to maintain peace or preserve relationships. But the strategies that once helped us adapt in the past do not always need to be carried with us for the rest of our lives. Over time, when a person begins to establish small boundaries and maintain them, they often realize something very interesting. The world does not collapse just because they cannot do everything for everyone. The relationships that truly matter usually do not disappear simply because they are no longer always available. On the contrary, many relationships begin to feel more genuine because they are no longer based on a fixed role but on mutual understanding. During this stage, a subtle shift also begins to occur in the way that persons sees themselves. In the past, they may have defined their self-worth through how useful they were to others. They felt meaningful when solving problems, when supporting, when becoming the person people turn to in difficult moments. But when they begin to create more space for themselves, they realize that a person's value does not lie only in what they do for others. A person also has value when they rest, when they take care of their mental health, when they spend time on things that make them feel alive and fulfilled. These things may sound simple, but for people who have been used to sacrificing too much, learning this again sometimes feels like learning an entirely new language. And in that process, they begin to realize another important truth about kindness. Sustainable kindness does not come from depletion, it comes from balance. When a person constantly gives to the point that nothing is left for themselves, their kindness gradually becomes a source of pressure. But when they take proper care of themselves, their kindness becomes more natural and lighter. This also changes the way others experience their help. When a person no longer always says yes each time they help carries more meaning. It is no longer an automatic reflex, but a choice. And actions that are consciously chosen often carry more presence and sincerity. Some people even realize that setting boundaries helps them become a better friend, colleague, or family member, because when they are no longer exhausted, they can truly listen. When they no longer feel forced to help, they can support others with a more open spirit. And when they no longer carry silent resentment, their care becomes purer. This is the most beautiful paradox of emotional balance. When a person stops sacrificing themselves unconsciously, they do not become less kind. Um, on the contrary, their kindness becomes healthier and more sustainable. They still care about others, but they also learn to care about themselves with the same level of respect. Over time, this creates a very different kind of presence in relationships. That person is no longer the one who always carries everything. They become someone with clear boundaries, emotional stability, and the ability to give without losing themselves. And such a presence often creates a very natural form of respect from the people around them. In the end, the deepest lesson many people discover is that kindness and self respect are not in conflict with each other. In fact, they need to exist together in order to become complete. When kindness is separated from self respect, it easily turns into endless sacrifice. But when kindness stands alongside self respect, it becomes a powerful and healthy source of connection. And that is perhaps the most important change, not becoming less kind, but learning how to be kind in a way that does not make you disappear from your own life. Because in the healthiest relationships, no one needs to disappear in order for someone else to exist. Each person has their own space, and it is within that space that genuine care can grow in a sustainable way.